for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. My name is Darren Gibson. I'm your host today. Jack Prince and Katie Steele are both off this week. Hopefully they will be returning next week. This week on the show, a lot of COVID news. We also have a Hammer Time segment. And now there are some Indigenous tribes looking to investigate Michigan's ties to Catholic schools and whether any children were killed at those schools. Well, we know that they were. We just don't know how many. We'll get to that story in just a little bit. Before we get started with today's show, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on Twitter at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime you like at Spreaker.com or at Stitcher.com by doing a search for Southpaws. You can find us on Apple Podcasts by searching for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and YouTube accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, WOOL in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and KEPJ San Antonio, Texas. So please make sure you listen to us there. Also, if you have a Pacifica station near you, please, we ask that you donate your time and or your money to them because they can always use both. We're recording the show on Friday, August 6, 2021. Today is the 76th anniversary of the U.S. dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. So I just want to acknowledge that. It also happens to be my oldest brother's birthday. So David, happy birthday to you. Let's go ahead and get into our news stories. I want to get to some COVID stuff here. This is Mina Kaji writing for ABC News. This is dated August 6th. United Airlines announced Friday that all U.S.-based employees will be required to receive a COVID-19 vaccine and upload their vaccination card to a company site by this fall. It is the first major U.S. carrier to mandate vaccines for all employees. Delta Airlines announced earlier this year that it is requiring all new employees to be inoculated. United joins a growing list of companies that have mandated vaccines for employees in some capacity. I have a little bit of a longer list here than what they provide in this story. So add United Airlines to CNN, Uber, DoorDash, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Walmart, Disney, and the National Football League, at least the staff of the NFL. Let me continue the story here. The airline's deadline for employees to upload their vaccine card is 5 weeks after the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has announced it has fully approved a COVID-19 vaccine, or 5 weeks after September 20th, whichever comes first. And by the way, the FDA is going to start fast-tracking approval of Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. So they're hoping that will be done in the next few weeks. So maybe September 20th as a deadline. Maybe United Airlines knows something that we don't know. In a memo, United CEO Scott Kirby and United President Brett Hart wrote this, quote, "For those employees who are already vaccinated and for those employees who get vaccinated and upload their records to Flying Together before September 20th, we'll offer an additional day of pay," end of quote. They added this to the memo, quote, "We know some of you will disagree with this decision to require the vaccine for all United employees, But we have no greater responsibility to you and your colleagues than to ensure your safety when you're at work. And the facts are crystal clear. Everyone is safer when everyone is vaccinated. End of quote. United's decision comes as fears mount about the highly contagious Delta variant. The executives wrote, quote, over the last 16 months, Scott has sent dozens of condolence letters to the family members of United employees who have died from COVID-19. We're determined to do everything we can to try to keep another United family from receiving that letter. End of quote. Last year, major U.S. airline CEOs pointed to low infection rates among their employees in an attempt to prove that air travel is safe. During a Politico event in September, Kirby said, quote, at United, but also at our large competitors, our flight attendants have lower COVID infection rates than the general population, which is one of multiple data points that speaks to the safety on board airplanes. End of quote. At the time, the largest flight attendant union in the U.S. that represents United flight attendants among other airlines, the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA AFL-CIO, said they saw a little over 1,000 flight attendants across the industry contract the novel coronavirus. That represented less than 1% of the roughly 120,000 flight attendants that were employed at the end of last year, and was lower than the reported general infection rate of 2%. So, yeah, United trying to show that it's safe to fly on airplanes. So there you go there. Yes, I applaud this. It's time. All employers need to start mandating vaccines, but they're going to come up with some hurdles here. I have a list here. These are states that have banned vaccine mandates for state and municipal employees and for schools. They are Utah, Montana, North Dakota, Arkansas, Tennessee, and New Hampshire. Now, Montana has also gone one step further. They have banned private employers from issuing vaccine mandates. Now, that I don't know if they can do. I think that's unconstitutional. So I'm hoping some private employers in Montana sues them because they'll probably lose that case. Other states have only issued vaccine mandate bans for schools, and they are Arizona, Oklahoma, Alabama, Florida, Indiana, and Ohio. So not a surprise, most of those states, well, with the exception of New Hampshire, and I'm not really sure what their politics are, but all Republican, violent, conservative states. There you go. Folks, Republicans don't care about you. They never have. They never will. And you know what? I'm getting to the point, hey, if you don't want to get the vaccine, good. I don't care anymore. If you get sick, don't go to the hospital. And actually, I'll go one step further. Please die. Please. We need to raise the IQ in this country a little bit, and this might be the way to do it. Speaking of raising the IQ, I've got this story. This is Lexi Lonis writing for The Hill. This is dated August 5th. Some employers are firing employees that refuse to get vaccinated. We've talked about Houston Methodist Hospital System firing just under 200 employees who refused to get vaccinated for one reason or another. So here's this story again, Lexi Lonis writing for The Hill. CNN has terminated 3 employees after they came to the office unvaccinated despite the network's vaccine requirement for those who come to work in person. The announcement of the terminations came from CNN President Jeff Zucker, according to a memo he sent to employees on Thursday that was seen by The Hill. The memo states this, quote, in the past week, we have been made aware of 3 employees who are coming to the office unvaccinated. Let me be clear, we have a zero-tolerance policy on this. End of quote. Again, that's the memo sent by CNN President Jeff Zucker. Zucker said the company had gone off the honor system for letting employees back in the office and has not required proof of vaccination. However, employees are still required to be fully vaccinated against the coronavirus to work either in the office or in the field. Zucker said it is expected that proof of vaccination will become a requirement of the Warner Media Pass Card process in the upcoming weeks. Zucker stated, quote, You need to be vaccinated to come to the office, and you need to be vaccinated to work in the field with other employees, regardless of whether you enter an office or not. Period. End of quote. So I have a feeling this Warner Media pass card process is similar to what United is doing, where you have to upload proof of your vaccine status, which is good. They need to do this. Like I said, I'm tired of making excuses for ignorant, fat-headed, uneducated morons. These are people who refuse to be educated. They refuse to see the truth. Zucker also announced that the official return date for CNN offices has been pushed back from September 7th to earlier mid-October amid rising COVID-19 cases across the country. Zucker said, quote, "This was not an easy decision and there is much to consider. The bottom line is that based on the information that is available today and what experts expect to evolve with the virus in the weeks ahead, September 7th no longer feels appropriate." End of quote. Zucker also said those who do go to the offices in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta must wear face masks regardless of vaccination status starting Thursday. So that's already started. Vaccine requirements have gained traction among companies as the Delta variant drives up coronavirus cases around the country. Other news media companies, including the Washington Post and the Washington Examiner, have implemented a vaccine requirement for its employees to return to the office. Like I said, this is great news. This is beautiful news. This needs to happen. Every employer needs to do this. You're helping your employees. You're helping your customers. That's the bottom line to that. And for those who, they shouldn't be allowed to mandate vaccines. I got news for you. I'm going to keep drilling it until it starts getting through your fat heads. Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905. A 7-2 ruling by the Supreme Court that said that states can mandate vaccines. Period. End of story. It is the law of the land. These violent conservatives, they don't care. They really don't. They're violent. Speaking of violence, we have some religious violence news to talk about. This is Carolyn Tien writing for Newsweek. This is dated July 28th. A man has been charged with capital murder for allegedly setting fire to his El Paso, Texas home with his mother and his brother still inside because they did not follow the Bible. That's according to an affidavit. 40-year-old Philip Daniel Mills has an extensive criminal record. His previous convictions include criminal trespassing and evading arrest, according to local news outlet KTSM. Last Thursday, firefighters who had been called to 6001 Fandango Place to put out a fire found a severely burned woman, 82-year-old Florence Annette Mills, walking out of the house. That's according to a press release from the El Paso Police Department. Florence Mills survived her ordeal, but she remains in critical condition, according to KTSM. However, her older son and Philip Mills' brother, 54-year-old Paul Mills, wasn't as fortunate. The firefighters managed to rescue him from the house, but he died of his injuries in an area hospital. Roger Torres, a longtime neighbor, told KFOX-14, quote, "Unfortunately, the mom lost her son. She lost two sons because the other one's going to prison." End of quote. Philip Daniel Mills was suspected of the crime because an officer saw him running in the area around the time the fire began. When he was taken into custody, he allegedly told a police detective that he wanted to kill his relatives because they did not follow the Bible, whatever that means. The police affidavit reads this way, quote, "He intentionally broke the television located in the living room because he needed to purge the home from evil." The defendant stated that he left the residence and allowed his mother to be in a happy place throughout the day and waited for both his mother and brother to go to bed before starting the fire. End of quote. Philip Mills allegedly told the detective he started the fire by pouring gasoline on a sofa. The affidavit continues, quote, "Once the sofa caught on fire, he walked outside the house and waited to see if his mother or brother would go outside, but they didn't. The defendant advised that he waited outside the residence with large rocks in his hands in the event that both his brother and mother had made it out of the burning residence." End of quote. When the detective informed Mills that his mother was still alive, he allegedly expressed shock and called it a failed attempt. In an email, El Paso Police Department Sergeant Enrique Carrillo told Newsweek that there are no additional statements on the case at present. So, there you go. We've talked about the violence of religion. Right there's another good case of it here. Cuckoo! Cuckoo! By the way, they also mentioned in the story that several weeks before this fire was set, in London, Kentucky, 37-year-old Sheena Johnston was accused of committing a similar crime. In early July, she allegedly set fire to her neighbor's mobile home in an attempt to cleanse this place. That's what she told investigators. She was cleansing the place. She has been charged with arson, attempted murder, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct, among other misdemeanors and felonies. So, yeah, there's another beaut right there. Jeez. Folks, I keep saying this, and I'll keep saying this till the end of this show. The most violent book ever wrote was the Bible. Just pick it up and read it. You don't have to go very far into the book. It's just plain as the nose on your face. It's disgusting is what it is. Unbelievable. Anyway, I want to get to the next story here. This is a friend of mine. We've been talking about employees rage quitting their jobs, refusing to go to work for poverty wages, which is pretty much what most employers pay these days. I hate to say it, especially if you work in the service industry. I've been seeing it around this area. The local Burger King has had to close their lobby because they don't have enough employees staffed to run indoor dining and the drive-thru. So they've shut indoor dining down and they're just operating the drive-thru at this point. It's just unbelievable. I never thought I would see this. Meantime, their competitors down the street are paying a higher wage and they're finding workers and they're busy all the time. So I'm not sure what to make of this. Well, I do know what to make of this. Employers need to start paying their people better wages. Offer more benefits. Most importantly, pay a higher wage. You want to get employees? That's the way to do it. But I'm not the only one that's seeing this. I want to read an article that was published July 7th at Business Insider. This is a new friend of mine. Her name is Anya Kane. I met Anya and her new husband, Kevin Greenlee, through a podcast that they produce called The Murder Sheet. Now, for those of you that may not know, I don't think I've discussed it on this show. I am producing a separate podcast on my own called the Burger Chef Podcast. I go back and I take a look at the history of the Burger Chef fast food chain. It's a passion of mine. I'm one of the larger collectors of Burger Chef memorabilia in the country. Well, Anya and Kevin did this podcast called The Murder Sheet. By the way, you can find that wherever you find your favorite podcast. But they talk about murders in the fast food business. And what got them started on this podcast was a murder that took place in November 1978 involving 4 employees of the Speedway, Indiana Burger Chef being kidnapped and murdered during a robbery. So I've talked to them. I'm actually going to be appearing on the Murder Sheet podcast probably sometime in November. Once I get a date, I'll let everybody on this show know. But Anya also writes for Business Insider, and she normally covers the big box stores for Business Insider. She also does some crime stuff too. But this is a story that she wrote as she was traveling across the East Coast for her honeymoon. So here's what she wrote. Again, this is Anya Kane for Business Insider. It's a rough time to be a hiring manager. In April, the Bureau of Labor Statistics said the number of job openings had hit a record 9.3 million. In many regions, blue-collar industries like retail, restaurants, and warehousing need more workers. Today's tight labor market represents a continuation of a pre-pandemic trend. In 2019, a war for talent was raging. But the coronavirus pandemic seems to have spurred specific trends like career epiphanies and rage quitting, a looming exodus of working women due to inadequate access to child care, and pay hikes from giants like Amazon, Walmart, and Target. The result is a rough labor market for businesses, especially smaller operators. The tightening labor market is also something I noticed while I should have been relaxing. I recently took time off from my wedding and honeymoon. Leaving our home in Indiana, my husband and I drove to upstate New York and Virginia, logging jaunts through Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia. We found ourselves in all sorts of small businesses, antique malls, fast food joints, big box stores, steakhouses, gas stations, grocers, drugstores, and mom and pop shops. Retail is one of those beats you can't ever really escape. The help wanted signs were everywhere. The rants popped up too. My husband snapped photos of two screeds accusing the American public of not wanting to work anymore. One from a New York burger joint and the other from a Virginia diner. These signs resembled other notices in viral posts on social media. All seem to blame individual businesses' hiring struggles on widespread laziness. They've also given the rise to a widely memed retort. No one wants to work for you. Most other businesses were plastered with somewhat less passive-aggressive signs touting open positions, even promising signing bonuses. Either way, it's obvious that we're in a job market that gives workers in lower-paid sectors a rare advantage. Still, the sloth-blasting signs bounced around my head as we visited historic Jamestown on the last day of our trip. Historic Jamestown is a cultural heritage site in Virginia, marking England's first permanent colony in North America. The colony was a product of a joint stock company's bid to exploit the area's resources, and the jumping-off point of evils that came to define the United States, like chattel slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. Those who learned about this topic in school may remember the narrative that the settlement nearly failed because the colonists were too idle to work. The reality is likely far more complicated. The historian Karen Ordhall Kupperman wrote the colonists were likely suffering from salt poisoning, malnutrition, and disease, along with the psychological trauma of watching their compatriots die. American workers died during the pandemic. American workers lost loved ones during the pandemic. American workers continued to contend with a deeply flawed health care system, debt, an untenable lack of child care, and a dearth of workplace protections. Business owners frustrated with the status quo ought to ditch the rants and instead raise wages and improve working conditions. Proprietors can keep up with the other businesses and attract more interested candidates by offering workers a truly worthwhile opportunity. And bravo. Good on Anya for reporting that. I totally agree. Folks, if you own a business and you can't find employees to work for you, maybe you should look at a couple things. One, how do you treat your employees? Do you treat them as valued, or do you treat them like they're a pain in the neck? Two, do you pay your employees well? That's the big one. Why should I put up with a lousy employer making $10 an hour when I could go work across the street for somebody that's paying $14 an hour or more? Why would I stay with you? Why would I be loyal to you? I'm going to tell you, folks, as somebody who has stayed at positions for way too long because of loyalty, I'm just going to tell you this. The only loyalty that you're going to find is within yourself. You need to be loyal to yourself first because you're the one that has to take care of yourself. Don't rely on somebody else to do it. Got news for you. Yeah, we need to have more cooperation, but here's the reality of it. It's not going to happen. Those times are over, with notable exceptions, I'll just say. As a matter of fact, there's one notable exception that was posted on Facebook recently. I want to read this here. This was written by a guy by the name of Brandon Rose. He wrote this, and he posted pictures of this. This is amazing stuff. He said, 2 years ago, at a 1,200-acre farm in Ritzville, Washington, around 60 neighbors helped harvest Larry Yackey's wheat. Yackey, battling stage 4 skin cancer, could no longer work his fields. When fellow farmers in Adams County found out, they got to work organizing a harvest for the 4th-generation farmer. The neighbors did 3 weeks' worth of work in just 6 hours as Yackey, his wife, and their 3 daughters looked on in awe. Turns out Larry Yockey had a bumper crop of good neighbors in the heart of the wheat country. This is what we need to be doing more of. Unfortunately, you have people who support violent conservatives, or they're violent conservatives themselves, and that's been the mantra for years. I got mine, you go get yours. No, that's not how it should be. It should be more of cooperation among neighbors. The problem is you got neighbors that can't get along anymore. And a lot of it's politically driven. Speaking of, I'm going to read this here. This is an opinion that was written by Robert Reich. Now, Robert Reich was the former Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. He published this on Facebook on August 1st. Here's what he wrote. Friends, I'm afraid we've become so inured to Donald Trump's proto-fascism that we barely blink an eye when we learn that he tried to manipulate the 2020 election. Yet the most recent revelation should frighten every American to their core. On Friday, the House Oversight Committee released notes of a December 27th telephone call from Trump to then Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen, in which Trump asks, maybe orders, Rosen to, quote, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman, end of quote. The notes were taken by Richard Donahue, Rosen's deputy, who was also on the call. Rosen obviously rejected Trump's request. But what if Rosen had obeyed Trump and said to the American public that the election was corrupt, and then left the rest to Trump and the Republican congressman? What would Trump's and the Republicans' next moves have been? And which Republican congressmen were in cahoots with Trump in this attempted coup d'etat? I'd like to know the answer to that question, and then I'd like to prosecute him, and then drop the jail on him for treason. Let me continue with Robert Reich's piece here. Make no mistake, this was an attempted coup. Trump knew it. Just weeks earlier, then Attorney General William Barr said the department had found no evidence of widespread fraud that could have overturned the results. And a few days after Trump's call to Rosen on January 2nd, Trump told Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Secretary of State, to find votes to change the election outcome. He berated Raffensperger for not doing more to overturn the election. Emails released last month also show Trump and his allies in the last weeks of his presidency pressured the Justice Department to investigate totally unsubstantiated claims of widespread election fraud, forwarding them conspiracy theories and even a draft legal brief they hoped would be filed with the Supreme Court. Should we just forget all this happened? No. For the first time in the history of the United States, we did not have a peaceful transition of power. Let me repeat that again, folks. For the first time in the history of the United States, we did not have a peaceful transition of power. For the first time in American history, we had a president who refused, still refuses, to concede and who continues to claim, with no basis in fact, that the election was stolen from him. For the first time in history, we had a president who actively plotted a coup. It would be bad enough if Trump were a mere crackpot acting out on his own pathetic stage, a would-be dictator who accidentally became president and then arranged an attempted coup, along with an assault on the U.S. Capitol when he lost the election, after which he was swept into the dustbin of history. We might then merely regret this temporary lapse in American presidential history. At best, he would be seen as a fool, and the whole disgusting affair an embarrassment to the country. But Trump was no accident, and he's not in any dustbin. He has turned one of America's 2 major parties into his own cult. He has cast the major political division in America as between those who believe him about the 2020 election and those who do not. Most Republican senators and representatives dare not cross him. By all accounts, he is running for president again in 2024. Donald Trump's proto-fascism has become the largest internal threat to American democracy since the onset of the Civil War. In my humble opinion, this final revelation, Trump's December 27th call to the acting attorney general, in which he pleads, just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me, should trigger Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars anyone from holding office who engaged in insurrection against the United States. I agree, wholeheartedly agree. Folks, if we're not going to enforce the Constitution, why do we have it? That's a question you need to start thinking about for yourselves. Really. The scary part is that Trump and his violent conservative cronies are still pushing this election fraud crap. It's bullshit. It totally is. And they're doing so right here in Michigan. I have this story. This is Craig Mauger writing for the Detroit News. This is dated July 30th out of Lansing. A committee inside the Michigan Republican Party plans to consider Saturday a proposal that calls for the resignation of GOP State Senator Ed McBroom, who led a probe finding no evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. While Norm Schinkel, the chairman of the party's Issues Committee, says he will oppose the resolution, its introduction points to the continued rift within the Michigan GOP over Donald Trump's loss in November. The proposed resolution obtained by the Detroit News describes the Senate Oversight Committee's 8th-month investigation into the 2020 election as the product of gross official misconduct. The resolution primarily focuses on the Senate report's suggestion that Democratic Attorney General Dana Nessel consider investigating individuals who pushed false claims about the election to raise money or publicity for their own ends. The proposed resolution says, quote, in the broader context of ongoing attacks against the American people's right to free speech and the right to counsel, the report bolsters and encourages these attacks in a transparent attempt to intimidate and silence all citizens, exposing the misconduct of election officials, challenging the results of the election, and advocating for legal and policy remedies, end of quote. Yeah, what's going on here, folks, is that the Michigan Republican Party, I'm not going to say GOP because there's been nothing grand about that party since day one. What they want to do is they want to shoot and kill the messenger because they don't like the message. That's all it is. Schinkel said the resolution was backed by Kurt Folds, a member of the Issues Committee from the 13th Congressional District. In an email to fellow Republicans, Schinkel described McBroom as a pro-life and pro-God lawmaker and the resolution as unhelpful and irresponsible. In an interview, Schinkel said of the proposed resolution, quote, this makes no sense, end of quote. But David Dudenhofer, chairman of the 13th Congressional District Republican Committee, said the resolution was supported by his group. Dudenhofer said McBroom had betrayed Republicans. He said, quote, we've got enough people attacking us without fellow Republicans attacking us. If you do that, you've got to go, end of quote. So Dudenhofer is basically trying to enforce the 11th commandment, which was basically fabricated by Ronald Reagan when he said, thou shalt never speak ill of another Republican. Let me continue here. McBroom, a first-term senator from the Upper Peninsula, said his panel had evidence of potential crimes and he had a legal and moral duty to refer the matters to Nessel. The referral is about very specific situations in which individuals were using misinformation while ignoring counter-information for their own benefit. In recent weeks, many of his Republican colleagues in the legislature have defended McBroom, labeling him a man of integrity. The Michigan Senate's report, led by McBroom of Vulcan, chairman of the Oversight Committee, was developed through 28 hours of committee testimony from about 90 people, a review of thousands of subpoenaed documents, and hundreds of hours of Senate staff investigation. The report's conclusion that there was no systemic fraud in the election directly conflicted with the statements of some GOP activists and Trump himself, who have continued to levy unsubstantiated claims of widespread wrongdoing in Michigan and have sought to overturn the battleground state's election results based on those assertions. Now, I'll just be blunt. Trump's a liar. I wouldn't trust anything he said if his tongue was notarized. Democrat Joe Biden won Michigan by 154,000 votes, or 3 percentage points. More than 200 reviews by election officials, bipartisan boards of canvassers, and a series of court rulings have upheld the outcome. The Oversight Committee's recommendation that Nestle investigate those spreading falsehoods about the election for their own gain has been controversial in Republican circles. The Democratic Attorney General has decided to take up the committee's suggestion, and rightfully so. In an interview in June, McBroom said his committee found what appeared to be potentially fraudulent activity among some individuals who have been making false claims about the election. The Michigan Republican Party has faced internal struggles since the November election over how to handle unproven claims of voter fraud. Its former executive director, Jason Rowe, who criticized Trump, resigned earlier this month, and some GOP lawmakers have called for a new audit of the election while others have opposed the idea. In addition to the resolution against McBroom, the Issues Committee is also scheduled to consider a censure resolution against U.S. Representatives Fred Upton, Republican of St. Joseph, and Peter Meyer, Republican, Grand Rapids Township, for supporting the creation of an independent commission to probe the violent January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol and a resolution calling for unity within the party. The proposed unity resolution says, quote, "For the sake of our children's future, we must win in 2022, end of quote. No, let me counter that. For the sake of everybody's future, the Republicans need to lose, need to go to the unemployment line in 2022. Oh, but going after conservatives is low-hanging fruit. Bullshit. It's telling the truth as it is. I've always said I will speak truth to power on this show. From word one, when I clicked the mic on in May of 2012, I said that I was going to speak truth to power, and I have. When there's been criticism of the Democrats, I criticize them. But Republicans are scum. They're scum-sucking idiots. All of them. They're not even idiots. They're evil. They're evil. Sorry, if you're a Republican, you're an evil person. Period. End of story. Don't even talk to me. The Detroit News finishes up, if the Issues Committee approves any of the resolutions, they can then go before the full Michigan Republican Party State Committee. Yeah, so basically, you've got the nut jobs, these followers of Trump. They want to control everything. They created their own monster within their own party because Republicans, all they want to do is have control. They don't want anybody else to have control. Hey, the Democrats are the same way. I'm just going to tell it like it is. The Democrats are the exact same way. They only want power. To hell with everybody else, to hell with the little people, but Republicans are worse because their policies directly affect working people. They directly go after working people to try and put them down. Democrats don't do that. Democrats just don't lift finger. There's your difference. Not much of a difference, but at least they're not actively trying to put the thumb down on your head. Just saying. Just saying. Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, God, speaking of. We might as well just go ahead with our next segment, but we need to play the appropriate music. Oh, yeah, it's hammer time. It is time to drop the hammer on the douchebag of the week. This is number 3 for the year at least. Our winner this week, Barry County, Michigan Sheriff Dar Leaf. I have this story. This is Heather Walker reporting for Wood Television, dated August 3rd. A Facebook post made by the Barry County Sheriff has raised concerns for community members who reached out to News 8. In a post made by Sheriff Dar Leaf, he talks about posses and militias being more lawful than the authorities that have recently arrested members of those groups. Many are interpreting his post as a shot at the FBI's investigation into the kidnapping plot of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Leaf touts himself as a constitutional sheriff, even offering classes on it. The sheriff has always been vocal, but recently he's turned to social media to connect and rally people, speaking out against President Joe Biden and in support of militias and their members, among other things. The latest post talks about sheriffs in Michigan having the ability to create a posse to ferret out or find criminal activity. He referenced the term posse comitatus, which is Latin for the power of the county. Some supporters commented on the post saying they were ready to join. Michael McDaniel, a professor of Homeland Security Law at Western Michigan University Cooley Law School, says Leif has the right to create a posse, but added that those groups would more than likely be quickly put to an end. McDaniel said, quote, "It's really, in my opinion, obsolete in this day and age," end of quote. He said the Michigan Constitution makes it clear that common law, which is where this comes from, is incorporated only when it doesn't contradict the Constitution or other state laws. McDaniel added, quote, "It certainly seems to me that if the sheriff was to use untrained, unlicensed, inexperienced members of the public as a law enforcement force, that he is opening up to the County of Barre Board of Supervisors to all sorts of liability because there is a statute that says the County Board of Supervisors have to indemnify the sheriff. If they did so, that would be very short-sighted," end of quote. He added that this idea the sheriffs hold more power because they are named in the Constitution is false. Quote, "They have no greater duty than any other law enforcement entity within the state," end of quote. By the way, Leif was not available for comment when News 8 reached out. Not a big surprise there. The director of the Michigan Sheriff's Association says it does not support the statement made by Leif. The association has previously condemned statements the sheriff has made publicly. And I'm just going to go a little bit further here, and I'm once again going to call for Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer to remove this clown from office. He is mentally ill. Hey, I've got mental illness. I'm speaking from a position of knowledge here. This guy is nuts. He cannot continue as sheriff of Barre County. He does not have the mental capacity to do so. You need to fire him. You have the right to do so. It's in the state constitution. The governor can remove a lawfully voted-in sheriff if he's not performing his duties to the letter of the law, and he's not right now, and he probably never will again. I don't trust the voters of Barre County to recall him because they're the same idiots, the same fat-headed morons that voted him in the first place. I tell you what, this is starting to pick up more steam across all sorts of media. Vice News is talking about him. This is pretty bad here. You know, I'll get to this because, you know, Darleif's not the only one. Tess Owen for Vice News, July 28th, has a story about Richard Mack, who's the leader of the Constitutional Sheriffs Movement. This is the guy that's starting this crap. Unbelievable. And by the way, this guy is not a real sheriff. He hasn't been a office-holding sheriff since the 1990s. Why is he leading this group? I can tell you why. Because they want to be violent. They want to push violence. This all started with Trump. Trump was the most violent president we ever had. Period. End of story. He's the guy that said, oh, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and my numbers would go up. You know, just beat the crap out of him. I'll pay your legal bills. He's on video. It's unbelievable. And people still follow this orange. I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't understand it. Ugh. It's nuts. It's insanity. Absolute insanity. It's not just Vice News that's reporting on this. Deadline Detroit is also reporting on this. They have this article published July 29th. If rural Michigan gets any weirder, it'll become unwise to stop for gas between Detroit and Mackinac City. Vice News does a deep dive on so-called constitutional sheriffs, heirs to the Posse Comitatus movement of the 1970s and 80s, including several in Michigan. The highest profile is Darleif of Barre County, who has made news in recent days after revelations that he wanted to seize voting machines to examine them for evidence of voter fraud, and that he has hired a private investigator to interrogate township clerks about their administration of the 2020 election. Last fall, after a number of men were arrested and charged with conspiring to kidnap and kill Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Leif suggested they merely wanted to arrest her for unspecified offenses. Essentially, constitutional sheriffs believe they are the final authority on matters of law and have power to decide which laws they will enforce, Vice reports. What's more, they are forging alliances with various anti-government extremists, including the Oath Keepers. Vice reports on the ringleader of the movement, Richard Mack of Arizona. Quote, a 69-year-old, several times failed political candidate and one-time reality TV star who goes by sheriff despite having not held that office since the early 1990s, end of quote. This guy is the leader of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. In Michigan, at least 3 or 4 sheriffs, most in the Northwest Lower Peninsula, either call themselves constitutional sheriffs or appear to be constitutional curious. In a Bridge magazine story last fall before the election, some commented on the then hypothetical question of possible voter intimidation. Since then, Leaf's investigations of still unfound voter fraud have made him a focus of attention. The Posse Comitatus movement of far-right extremists has splintered somewhat, with sovereign citizens and various anti-government groups having roots there. Yeah, folks, this is a danger to the country. This is a terroristic threat to the country right here. These nut jobs, these wackadoodles, whatever you want to call them. Once again, Gretchen Whitmer, you need to fire Dar Leaf. Get him out of office now. So Dar Leaf, once again, winner of Douchebag of the Week, we've got this message for you. Yeah, that's right. Dar Leaf needs to stop being a power-hungry douchebag, because that's all that he is. Speaking of power-hungry, we've got these people. Here's some more nut jobs. This is Jordan Williams writing for The Hill. This is dated July 30th. A federal judge on Friday told off a Capitol riot defendant who refused to wear a mask during his hearing, telling the defendant, "You don't make the rules." The confrontation took place during a hearing for defendant Daniel Goodwin, according to the Washington Post.
Don't be a douchebag.
He pleaded not guilty in April to 5 charges in connection with the January 6th riot. According to court records, prosecutors were trying to revoke Goodwin's pretrial release over his behavior, including repeatedly flouting orders to wear a mask. During Friday's hearing, Goodwin's attorney, Daniel Hull, explained to Judge Reggie Walton that Goodwin had autism, which makes it harder for him to wear a mask, the Post reported. But when asked why he wouldn't wear one, Goodwin simply stated, "It stresses me out," adding, quote, "I believe I would not cause someone to die by not wearing a mask," end of quote. Instead of locking him up, Walton decided to order Goodwin to wear a mask whenever he meets with pretrial services or appears in court, according to the newspaper. But Walton was clear, quote, "If you can't do that, I'm going to have no alternative but to lock you up and keep you locked up until this case is resolved. They don't have to put their lives at risk. They don't have to, and they will not," end of quote. And he's talking about court staff. Goodwin replied, quote, "I understand, but I'm not going to do that, sir," end of quote. He added that Texas does not require masks indoors. Judge Walton fired back, quote, "I don't care what the law in Texas is. You don't make the rules. You will be arrested," end of quote. When Goodwin was arrested at his parents' home in Texas, the FBI learned that at least one person in the home believed they had COVID-19. When agents placed a mask on his face, Goodwin, according to prosecutors in a court filing, quote, "attempted to chew through the mask and spit the mask out," end of quote. Goodwin was released to home confinement in February, but prosecutors said he repeatedly refuses to wear a mask, show up to meetings, or report his location. Since his arrest, according to prosecutors, Goodwin has, quote, "flouted the conditions, making clear that he does not appreciate the privilege of pretrial release provided to him by the court," end of quote. Well, there's a simple solution to that. Round him up, drop the jail on him. There you go. I would say you're not getting out until your trial. This is what needs to happen to these people. I got news for you. You're not in charge. You little violent conservatives. You're not the boss. Got news for you. Got big news for you. Oh, Jesus. I want to finish up real quickly here. We're not going to be able to get all of this story in, but once again, Heather Walker at Wood TV. I'm going to give kudos right here to Wood Television and to Heather Walker for doing this story. We have talked on this show over the last several weeks about what's been happening in Canada with the bodies of Indigenous children being found on the grounds of former, what I call re-education schools, because that's what they were. That's when Canadian officials took Indigenous children from their parents, forced them to learn English, got rid of their customs, forced them to wear English clothes, basically got rid of their culture. This wasn't culture appropriation. This was the destruction of culture. Well, we've talked about the schools here in Michigan. Now they're starting to get some push to investigate whether there were children killed and buried on these properties. This is Heather Walker writing August 1st for Wood Television out of Harbor Springs. The discovery of unmarked mass graves at Indigenous boarding schools in Canada is sparking fear similar discoveries could be made in Michigan. The same types of boarding schools that existed in Canada were also in the United States. Michigan was home to the longest-running one in the nation. Located in the resort town of Harbor Springs in the northern Lower Peninsula, it did not close until the 1980s. Tribes say such boarding schools contributed to the genocide of Native Americans. Harbor Springs hosts summer homes for the wealthy. Well-manicured lawns line the view of the bay. Downtown is filled with shops, art galleries, and restaurants. At the end of Main Street is Holy Childhood of Jesus Catholic Church. The Native children who attended the boarding school linked to that church called it Unholy Childhood. Kateri Walker, who was a student at the school when she was a child, said, quote, "Children did die here," end of quote. The history is hidden in plain sight. Only one entrance and a classroom were negotiated to remain of the boarding school when it was torn down. Walker added, quote, "If I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know. You would go, oh, why is that brick there? Each of these bricks stands for a child," end of quote. Walker is one of an estimated tens or perhaps hundreds of thousands of children who attended Native boarding schools that were primarily run by religious organizations and overseen by Washington. The federal government took over the schools in the late 1800s with the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And Jack has talked about that multiple times. Kateri Walker said, quote, "Everyone in America can be who they want to be, but we're not allowed to be who we are. There's a manual how to break our spirit. There's an actual school manual that exists," end of quote. She was 6 years old when she was brought to Holy Childhood boarding school by her mom. Other children were taken from their homes in the middle of the night. Some families taught their children to hide and seek to avoid being taken away. The idea behind the boarding schools was to remove America's so-called Indian threat by taking the next generation, ending their cultural practices, forcing them to speak English, and cutting their hair, which in Native American culture holds memories. The only boarding school still standing in Michigan is the Indian Industrial Boarding School in Mount Pleasant. Roughly 300 students attended every year. Two others, the Holy Name of Jesus Indian Mission in the Upper Peninsula and Holy Childhood in Harbor Springs, have been torn down. But Walker remembers, quote, "It's scary. I used to get migraines talking about it. I used to think as a 6-year-old, I'm going to tell. And here I sit as an adult, and I'm speaking, and I'm telling," end of quote. The schools were set up like a prison, she said. Quote, "We didn't have names, we had numbers. My number was 2 my first year," end of quote. The days filled with school, chores, and church, and abuse, Walker said, physical, emotional, and sexual. She said, quote, "Orgies happened in the basement," end of quote. According to historical accounts, boys were the main target of sexual abuse by nuns, but everyone was fair game for beatings. She said, quote, "When you heard the nuns' footsteps coming on the wood and you saw those shadows in the big windows, you would go, 'Sister's coming, sister's coming.' So everyone would clean and run. You didn't want to be near the door because when she came in swinging, she would hit whoever was there," end of quote. Children were kept away from their families for months, sometimes years. If they told their family about the abuse, it would get worse. Walker recalls being punished for hugging her mom for too long at the end of a visit when she was 9. And parents were denied visits. A letter shared by the Saginaw Chippewa tribe shows a mother pleading to see her child. It read in part, "I want to know if I can get my little daughter home for vacation. I sometimes get lonesome for her." Walker, who's now 57, said that while the school was a traumatizing and humiliating experience, she still considers herself one of the lucky ones. She was able to leave the boarding school in 1977 when she was 12. She went on to graduate from the University of Michigan and pursue acting in Hollywood. She said her success allowed her to avoid suicide and addiction that many of her classmates succumbed to. As she was breaking down in tears, Walker said, quote, "My tears are for those people that didn't get to have innocence. They didn't get to have laughter. They don't know love." End of quote. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is asking former students to share their experiences like Walker. And they apparently have an online registry to do that. So just do a search for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition on the internet. You can find them pretty easily. The recent discovery of the unmarked mass graves in Canada is sparking renewed efforts to find the students who never came home from the schools in Michigan. Some 215 bodies were discovered at a Canadian boarding school in May, more than 750 graves in June, and then 182 more bodies. The United States has yet to look for graves at its schools. James Bud Day, the cultural director for the Matchibineshiwish Band of Potawatomi Indians, which is more commonly known as the Gun Lake Tribe, said, quote, "We just want the proper justice for our young ones that were taken from us." End of quote. Tribes say hundreds of students pass through Michigan's 3 Indigenous boarding schools each year for more than 80 years. Some students never left. Day said he has heard firsthand accounts of people burying bodies at the school grounds. Day has also seen an incinerator at one school in Michigan, which leads him and others to believe that some of the children's bodies may have been burned. But Day and other tribal members believe if old school grounds are searched, there will be bodies. He said, quote, "Just going by the odds alone, there has to be. That's why us as Native communities, we want those investigations done." End of quote. In 1997, Holy Childhood moved student remains found on the property to Holy Childhood of Jesus Cemetery in Harbor Springs. A single white cross was put up on the old property in their honor. Still, tribe members believe there are more remains scattered on the property. Target 8 asked the Catholic Diocese of Gaylord, which ran the school, for the death records, but was told they cannot be found. Walker said, quote, "There's probably Native people laying here now as we speak." End of quote. In Mount Pleasant, boarding school records show 5 documented deaths, but research by Central Michigan University professor Sarah Surface Evans found at least 227 children died there, calling into question the validity of the school records that exist. What the CMU professor couldn't find is where the bodies were laid to rest in Mount Pleasant. Skipping a little bit further into the piece, still unknown to tribal members is how many Native American children died or went missing from the boarding schools. Walker said that it is the state's responsibility to find that out. She and other tribal members, along with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Association, say the least the state and or federal government can do is help find the children. When Target 8 asked whether any searches were planned, Governor Gretchen Whitmer's office did not immediately have any comment. Some tribal members say that if the government won't step up, the tribes will do it themselves. Day said, quote, "We want that justice for them. We want that healing for those families, whether it was generations ago or not. We want their spirits to be set free." End of quote. I'm glad that Heather Walker's talking about this. Folks, that's going to wrap things up for this episode of Southpaws. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media and the First Amendment.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.